All right, thank you very much for the invitation. Today's talk is about networks, maybe not always multiplex networks, but anyway, and I will start actually with networks in our globalized world, because we have really networked everything by now. Billions of mobile phones, computers, factories, and increasingly through the Internet of Things also cars, bridges, and so on. So what does it imply? First of all, great opportunities, of course. We have a global exchange of people, money, goods, information, ideas, and everything. But at the very same time, the network infrastructures also create pathways for disaster spreading. And one example is actually the cascading effects that we've seen in power grids in the recent years. On November 4, 2006, for example, a ship of the Meierwacht had to pass, and one of the power lines had to be switched off. Of course, they did a computer simulation before, everything looked fine, but then there was, by coincidence, another problem, and as a result of that, we had blackouts all over Europe. Now you can see how complicated this pattern is, really difficult to predict, and one of the challenges. To stay within the area of energy, I'd like to point to a recent study I've done with Rui Carvalho, Lucas Busner, and others, and there's a separate talk on this. Didn't happen already, Roy is here. And the question that we've been asking is how resilient is actually our European gas supply network. In particular, as we mainly get our gas supply from three areas, which is Scandinavia, Russia, and Northern Africa. And two of those areas are politically sometimes a little bit unpredictable in terms of potential gas deliveries that could have impacts. And so the question is, how would we handle that kind of situation? Now you could think, if we get less gas because one of those areas is not delivering anymore, there shouldn't be any capacity problems with the pipelines. But this is not true, in fact, because we'll have to use the network of pipelines in a different way that it was not designed for. And that creates unexpected congestion, and it requires a strategy to cope with that congestion. And if you just leave it to the markets, it could end up in a situation where some countries get a lot of gas and others get almost nothing. That could create a real big political crisis. Same thing if you just optimize the efficiency of the network, and in that situation you would also have areas which get nothing. So what we came up with is an effective fairness strategy, which is inspired by the way the internet works. And it turns out that Europe actually, if it handles gas supplies in such a way, is surprisingly resilient to such kinds of shocks. In order to really carry out this study, it's important, however, to bring different data sets together. So we need to have data sets about the major urban areas. We need to have data sets about the gas pipeline network and the deliveries, and also about the population. So it took quite a long time to carry out this study, and we are proud to say that now it's finished and it's submitted. Another network to be concerned about is, of course, the financial network, and here is a video that has been produced by the FOG project that Frank Schweitzer is involved in, Stefano Battiston, Guido Caldarelli, and others. So thank you for providing this video. It shows cascading effects in the banking system triggered by the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. Many other banks have failed, and that has created actually huge losses of hundreds of billions of is to understand these kinds of processes and of course to learn how to stop them. And for this, first of all, we need to recognize that more and more networking might also destabilize systems. What is shown over here is a model that has been simulated, assuming a social dilemma interaction situation between the agent. That could be people, but it could also be banks or companies or whatsoever. And we start off with neighborhood interactions, which are good for cooperation. Cooperation is displayed in blue, while defection is shown in red. What you can see is as we add random shortcut links in the system, in the beginning, the increasing connectivity increases the level of cooperation up to almost 80% in this kind of simulation. That's very nice. So what you would do is you network more because it has been good in the past. So you go here and then say, oh, that was nice, so let's network it even more, and you get up here. And eventually, however, as you go on networking the system, you get into a situation where cooperation erodes and you end up in a tragedy of the commons. And the question is, was that maybe the root cause of the financial meltdown that we've seen in 2008? In fact, Andy Helbing of the Bank of England has been looking at banking networks, and it turns out that the network became denser and denser over time until maybe it was just too much and triggered off this meltdown that we might be able to understand as a social dilemma or public goods problem. Because as soon as you are in an interaction situation where you can get extra benefits by cheating others, you're basically in a social dilemma situation. Now the situation becomes even more difficult as we continue networking different networks with each other. So that creates hyper-connected systems. We know that networks are particularly vulnerable. And I'd like to mention the work of Helbing in this connection. And some people have been very concerned about it because it could create something like a global time bomb, as I've been calling it, or perfect storm, as the World Economic Forum has been calling it, where basically blackout in one system could trigger blackouts in other systems. So the question is, what can we do to avoid that kind of situation? And one thing that people often do is they're strengthening the system in certain parts, but it turns out that they're often strengthening parts that are already strong. Yeah? So companies investing into financial assets which are already a much more robust situation than in other countries, for example, would get rid of risky assets, thereby, of course, becoming more robust, but on the other hand, it would weaken other investors. The bad or poisonous assets will end up somewhere in the end. So it's important to strengthen the weak parts of the system, and in particular it's also important, I think, to have something like engineered breaking points that would be able to interrupt cascade effects. In fact, we have such engineered breaking points in every flat at home in order to avoid that a local overload situation would burn down your house. So, to our very surprise, we didn't find such a system in place in our financial system, and the question is why. I personally do think it's possible to engineer financial fuses, but that would probably require economists to sit together with engineers and maybe also complexity scientists, and that's actually what I'd like to propose, to sit together in order to exchange the knowledge that has been collected in different fields to come up with innovative solutions and better network systems, because all networks have this problem of potential cascading effects, and for that reason a responsible design of networks would always have engineered breaking points. You put them in places where there would not be much damage if those points break, in order to protect other parts of the system which are more valuable and more important. Now, unfortunately, there are a number of trends actually that produce a higher degree of vulnerability, such as a reduction of redundancies to save money and increase networking, higher complexity, faster dynamics, and a high pace of innovation that doesn't allow us basically to determine unwanted side effects before they happen. But there are also a number of responses that you can develop in order to make your system more resilient. For example, you could have backup strategies, a plan B, you should have contingency plans, you could have real-time feedbacks, you could have a certain level of decentralization, you could simplify your system, could increase diversity, limit system size, or you could introduce dynamic decoupling strategies, as I have suggested that in my previous slide. And also transparency, accountability, responsibility, and awareness are very important. We need to be aware that complex systems, as we are facing them today in our society, in our economy, in many technological systems, including the internet, computer systems, and almost everything, are not very well predictable in their behavior. So maybe it's possible to make short-term predictions with a certain probability, but we cannot rely on predictions. And that means we cannot plan well, and it means that it's important that we come up with flexible adaptation strategies that allows us to handle with unpredictable dynamics. The other point is that these systems are difficult to control. So we might want to change the system in a certain way and modify a parameter accordingly, but in many cases it turns out, to the great disappointment to managers or politicians, that not much happens. And so they might say, okay, we have to try harder. And so you move here, and still not much happens. And so you push the system even harder, and suddenly there is a transition that happens at a tipping point that you didn't expect, and changes your system into a completely different kind of system. So, for example, your staff doesn't trust you anymore, or whatever. I mean, there can be many things that can happen. We've seen phase transitions also on the scale of countries. For example, the breakdown of the former GDR or the revolutions in Arabic countries and so on. So we must be aware that due to those dynamic interaction effects, systems can get out of control. Here's a very nice example. Very simple task, drivers go in a circle, but you see after some time there is a perturbation and it causes a so-called phantom traffic jam. We don't get rid of this phantom traffic jam anymore, but the main point here is, although everybody is trying to avoid that kind of situation, it's still happening. And although they have all the information that you would think is needed to do the task, and good technology, and best intentions. So that is an example for a systemic instability. And you can expect to see such kind of systemic instabilities in many other kinds of systems as well. for example, the financial system. And that basically means that no matter whether we have all the data and all the technology and best intentions, if you operate a system in the wrong parameter regime, if your system is wrongly designed, it will get out of control sooner or later. And so we need to design them in a different way and operate them in a different way. We know, for example, that such kind of phantom traffic jams also can occur in supply chains. The beer game is a very nice example that you can play with a number of people, and it will show you, even if you play it with experienced managers, that your supply and demand situation will get out of control if you just see basically your customer and your supplier and nothing else. So again, we have such an amplification effect that creates a cascading effect and a very undesirable situation. And the question is, what does it really mean for our world economy? Now, production processes are usually supply networks, and so what effect does a supply network have on the dynamics of our production system or our economic system? And we came up with equations describing the flows of materials in the system, in particular also an adaptation of delivery rates and of prices, and the consumption, which is a little bit fluctuating. Now, as you can see, there is a delayed adaptation of delivery rates and prices, and this delay matters in the end. We can have two different kinds of situations in terms of the input and output matrices. Either we can have real eigenvalues only or complex eigenvalues. In the case of real eigenvalues, we can have two kinds of situations, either damped oscillations or overdamped behavior. So your system would eventually go into an equilibrium, that's fine. However, the normal situation is that your input-output matrix has complex eigenvalues, and then you have either damped oscillations or growing oscillations, and that is a situation you don't want to happen, but unfortunately it does happen. So we've been looking at this for the global supply network between the different sectors of our economy, and done a computer simulation, and it turns out that it produces business cycles. In fact, irregular business cycles as we see them in reality, not periodic ones. And these are the outcomes of network interactions in our supply networks combined with delayed adaptation. So networks somehow imply instability here. And we could view recessions as something like a traffic jam of our world economy. So booms and recessions are like stop-and-go waves on our freeways. Understanding that might actually allow us to improve the situation. And in fact, I've changed the structure of supply chains from linear to this kind of ladder structure, to the hierarchical structure over here, and it turns out they have very different dynamics. If you have a varying demand, in the first case you get very large oscillations actually of supply. In this case also the oscillations are quite high, but in the case of this ladder structure you can almost perfectly dampen out those oscillations. That's very interesting. So this redundancy of having two possible ways of delivery is changing the situation dramatically. And it turns out that maybe by chance, maybe by experience, maybe by planning, Infineon not Intel technologies, actually have a very similar global supply chain. So I consider that good evidence for our theoretical approach. Now, there is a game changer in the field, which is big data. We're getting now data about all sorts of activities in technological, environmental, social, and economic systems. What could we do with all those data? Well, in principle, we could imagine to map global supply networks in real time, and in this way give everybody advanced information that allows you to compensate for the delays in your adaptation. So you could really stabilize the production system and avoid the stop and go waves. In a similar way as we have developed traffic assistance systems which can dissolve traffic jams. So having advanced information would really help the system and might allow to avoid recessions much more than we can do it today. We've also been interested in flows in traffic networks and been looking at 3 different ways of organizing these networks. Today it's quite common to have a top-down optimization. Central traffic control authority that collects information, then tries to optimize the traffic light schedule and give commands to all the systems. So you could call that a benevolent dictator. It's trying to do the best thing for everybody. We'll see how well that works. Then the competitive approach is that of Adam Smith's assuming an invisible hand kind of self-organization of agents that separately from each other optimize their situation. So let's assume each intersection is minimizing the waiting times of the approaching cars. That can be done mathematically not difficult at all. So every intersection is trying locally to do the very best thing. And the third thing is what I call the homo socialis, which is also trying to minimize the waiting times, but it also takes care of possible impacts on the neighboring intersection. So in some sense it's other regard. That's why I call it homo socialis strategy. Namely, if a queue grows long, it will be served in a prioritized way, in this way avoiding spillover effects that this intersection would not need to care about, but it would mess up the situation here and everywhere else upstream. Let's see how well this performs. Actually, here is a simulation of self-regulation principle that was inspired by oscillatory flows of pedestrians and bottlenecks. So these oscillations happen based on a pressure principle without the need of traffic lights. We say, okay, then why don't we use these self-organized oscillations as an underlying principle to define traffic light control at intersections? And it works beautifully. It creates wonderful green waves, as you can see over here, by self-organization. And it creates basically islands of synchronization. I mean, the same color means the synchronized areas. You can see, however, those synchronized areas are changing all the time, which is due to the adaptiveness of the approach. Now, the result is quite astonishing. The top-down regulation does a reasonable job, but not more, although we would expect it to be the best. Instead, the homo economicus approach, where we have the selfish optimization locally of each intersection, much better, with a much smaller queue length. However, only up to a certain level of the capacity utilization of the intersection, and then Adam Smith's invisible hand principle breaks down, and Q lengths explode, and local coordination doesn't work out anymore. However, the other regarding self-organization a la Homo socialis, that is taking into account what's happening at the neighboring intersection, that is performing as well as the Homo economicus at low utilization, and is best performing up to very high utilization. So that means self-regulation is the superior organization principle for systems that are largely varying and hardly predictable, and therefore require flexible response. Now you could say, okay, you've shown this Barcelona kind of road network, or New York, Manhattan-style road network. That's simple to synchronize. But we have also been looking at much more complicated road networks, such as in Dresden, where basically public road authorities have given up on this area because they were really not satisfied with the best state-of-the-art control they could get. They implemented actually a green wave for cars, but they wanted to prioritize all those tram lines and bus lines also. And if they would prioritize public transport, however, they would really get a messy congestion for cars. So they couldn't reach both goals at the same time, but our flexible self-regulation actually was able to solve this problem, and actually to the benefit of everybody. That means cars had a smaller waiting time, the delay of public transport was much reduced, and even pedestrians and cyclists had a better situation. And by the way, it's better also for the environment. So it's time to change. I'm now eventually entering the two subjects that were on the title slide of my talk, epidemic spreading. This, of course, is also based on social networks, in particular air transport. We know that spatial temporal spreading patterns are very complicated, hardly predictable, and you can see it in these clouds of points that they're really widely scattered. That's work with Dirk Brockman, recently submitted. And we found actually a way of transforming the spreading problem by introducing an effective distance based on the transportation matrix, and it shows you a much simplified picture with linear interdependencies that allow you to define a spreading speed and allow you to predict actually the spreading process all over the world. And so it becomes really a simple diffusion process within this new distance. And to compare it, I'm showing you a video over here which compares the geographical representation of the disease spreading with the representation effective distance. Of course, that is much simpler, and can also be used, by the way, for origin detection. The situation becomes more dramatic if you also take into account healing costs. And immunization and also medical treatment is expensive. I don't know why there's no video. But we have basically been looking at what happens if we add just a few shortcuts, which would correspond in some sense to air transport. And it turns out that the total damage that is caused to the system is exploding at a certain connection density, where basically the healing costs become too big to be covered by the healthy people. And that is something which, by the way, is also relevant, of course, for our financial system. We may just not be able to pay for the healing of the system. Another epidemic kind of spreading pattern is cultural spreading. And this is a work that done together with Maximilian Schick, Laszlo Harabashi, and many others. Maximilian has been looking at 2,000 years of birth-death data of notable individuals, artists in particular. And you can see how actually culture is spreading, and you can reconstruct the whole history of arts through those birth-death data. And even more things can be seen, like, for example, the footprint that the Second World War is leaving in the birth-death data and so on. What you're seeing here is that from Rome, there is a spreading process going on eventually to many other European metropoles. And there are some areas where artists go away, and other areas that attract artists, and which are the cultural centers, obviously. So it's quite astonishing how much can be reconstructed from these kind of data. It's the same kind of data for the United States. And so first people are basically arriving at the East Coast, and eventually they're moving the West Coast and basically colonizing the whole country, as you can see over here. So, of course, you cannot just produce beautiful movies, but also create a quantitative analysis that really shows you what are the motors of art, of the area of arts, of culture, how does it develop, and there are patterns that actually are surprisingly similar to today's mobility patterns, as they have been measured with mobile phone data. So there is really some universality that spans over hundreds, if not thousands of years. But one particular nice thing is that you can use these regularities basically to measure deviations from the average behavior. While the physicist is interested in those laws and the characteristic regularities, the art historian, somebody from the humanities, is often interested in the deviations from the average, because that is a noteworthy event that deserves to be looked into. And so these kind of things can actually be identified by combining data with other kind of data that are available on the web, so you can really do a kind of semi-automatic analysis of cultural evolution and identifying notable events. Thank you very much for your interest.